31 people just walked away from you without a single word. You grip the scraping stone so hard the edge cuts your palm, and you run. Not after them, but toward the ridge, because staying still on open steppe means something with teeth finds you before dark. Your lungs burn. Your eyes are scanning every patch of tall grass because you already know, in a way no one had to teach you, that predators pick off the animal moving alone. Tusk, your wide-eyed companion who once spent an entire afternoon poking a dead hornet's nest, would bolt the same direction without thinking twice. So here is the question that should keep you up at night. How long could a single exiled human actually survive against the full weight of the Pleistocene world? Not hours. The honest answer rewrites everything we assume about why ancient humans clung to their groups with what looks, from the outside, like pure desperate madness. And once you see it clearly, every piece of early human behavior suddenly snaps into focus. Surely anyone with basic survival training can push through a few days of discomfort? Isn't this just urban fragility dressed up in prehistoric clothes? It would be, except the people falling apart in the data aren't office workers on a camping trip. They're trained survival instructors, the exact people you'd want beside you when things go wrong. Here's why that matters. The moment you separate from your group in the Pleistocene, a clock starts, and it is not counting down from a comfortable number. Researchers studying experimental lone survival challenges found that even trained modern adults in temperate environments without group support suffer measurable cognitive impairment within 48 to 72 hours. Degraded decision-making arriving precisely when the situation demands the opposite. 48 hours. That's 2 nights in a forest before your judgment begins eating itself. This is what you need to understand about the isolation onset cascade. It isn't a mood. It's a sequence. Anxiety sharpens into vigilance. Vigilance burns fuel. Fuel runs out. And suddenly the trained professional who knows exactly what to do cannot quite remember the order of steps. The brain, running a threat detection system never built for quiet, keeps scanning for the group that isn't there. It finds nothing. Your nervous system was not designed for solitude the way a hammer isn't designed for soup. It's the wrong tool, confused by the task, making everything worse by trying harder. The panic you feel alone in the dark isn't weakness. It's ancient accuracy, a readout from a system that correctly understood, for hundreds of thousands of years, that alone meant dead. The system isn't broken. What makes this remarkable is the speed. 72 hours isn't a slow erosion, it's a cliff edge. A survival instructor, someone who has rehearsed exactly this scenario, crosses that line and starts making the kind of small, compounding errors that in a temperate forest mean a twisted ankle, and in a Pleistocene landscape with actual predators means something final. The group wasn't comfort. It was the cognitive infrastructure you were running on. Panic, in other words, is not a character flaw your ancestors couldn't train away. It's a warning light on a dashboard that was reading the environment correctly. The group kept the light off. Alone, it comes on fast. If the mind fractures within 72 hours, what happens to the body in the days that follow? And that's the territory of the caloric cliff. You wake up hungry. Not emergency hungry, just the ordinary human hunger that arrives every few hours like an uninvited houseguest who never learned to read a room. The difference now is that nobody else is dealing with it but you. Here is why this matters more than it sounds. Anthropologist Kim Hill spent years studying the Ache foragers of the Paraguayan Chaco, and in 1996, he published findings that should make every survivalist podcast host sit quietly with their feelings. A lone adult Ache forager must spend roughly 8 to 10 hours each day just finding and processing enough calories to stay alive at baseline. Not thriving, not building, just not dying. That is the whole day. The sun comes up, you forage. The sun goes down, you collapse. There is no afternoon left over for repairing a cracked spear shaft, reinforcing a leaking shelter, or, crucially, sleeping enough to do it again without falling apart. Anthropologists call this the metabolic solitude trap, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The trap is elegant in its cruelty. Every hour you spend foraging is an hour you are not repairing the tool that makes foraging faster, which means tomorrow takes longer, which means the day after that you have even less surplus, which means the repair never happens. It is a spiral shaped exactly like a drain. You are not starving dramatically. No single catastrophic moment, no fatal mistake. You are just slowly trading every non-food hour you have until there are none left. And somewhere around week 3, your body sends your brain a polite but firm note that the arrangement is no longer working. This is the thing that reframes everything about human evolution. We are not generalists who happen to enjoy company. We are nodes in a network, and a node without a network has no surplus, none, for anything except dying slowly and with great tedium. The Ashe data is not a curiosity. It is a proof. Cooperation is not a social luxury we bolt onto survival. It is the load-bearing wall. Picture it. You have brought down something worth eating, and it is large enough to matter. You need to move it. You need to watch for predators while you sleep. You need one other set of hands for 30 seconds, and the realization that crosses your face is the same stunned, increasingly desperate thought. I need literally one other person, arriving like a notification you cannot dismiss. Even if you could find enough food, could you hold on to the tools to get it? Or would the tools themselves betray you, which is exactly the question waiting in skills you cannot own? So here's the objection you're already forming. Surely a skilled adult keeps their skills, because skills live inside their own head. Oh, reasonable. Every technique you carry, the exact wrist roll that thins a flint edge, the temperature that makes silkcrete flake cleanly, you learned from a person standing over your shoulder who learned it from someone standing over theirs. The tool in your hand isn't just stone. It's a crystallized memory of every lesson your group ever handed down, walking around disguised as an object you own. Will Robrooks and colleagues at Leiden University have run the experiment directly, replicating Acheulean hand axes from scratch, and the finding lands hard. Producing one functional hand axe requires hundreds of hours of deliberate, taught practice, not hundreds of hours of tinkering. An exiled juvenile cast out before that apprenticeship completed doesn't just lack experience. They lack the motor grammar entirely. The way a child removed from language at age 4 never quite builds the syntax back. Robrooks' work means exile at the wrong age is essentially a slow deletion. But even a fully trained adult isn't safe. Curtis Marian's excavations at Pinnacle Point, South Africa, revealed a behavioral package in place around 164,000 years ago that should give you pause. The people there combined shellfish harvesting, red pigment use, and heat treatment of silkcrete into a single interlocked system. And Marian's team argues these skills formed a bundle, each one depending on the others, and all of them depending on the social network that transmitted them. Pull one thread, and the fabric doesn't just fray, it stops existing, which is a polite way of saying your intelligence was never stored in your skull. It was stored between skulls, spread across maybe 30 people, like a single mind running on 30 processors. Then comes the status flip. You assumed the exiled individual was the problem, the broken one, the liability, but the skills were the group's property all along, only renting space in your head. You didn't own them, they were on loan. Sit with that for a second. This is distributed cognition collapse. Isolation doesn't strip your status, it strips your competence, skill by skill, like a language you stop speaking. Meanwhile, each time you attempt a task that needs 2 pairs of hands, bracing a carcass, watching the tree line while you sleep, cracking marrow without the bone rolling, the same stunned thought crosses your face, now with a quality approaching grief. I need literally one other person, but what if the exile was already injured before they were cast out? Does the body collapse even faster than the mind, which is exactly the question that opens the wound that wins? But that's not the strange part about injury in the ancient world. The strange part is that the bones themselves tell you whether a Neanderthal had friends. Paleoanthropologist Eric Trinkhaus at Washington University, St. Louis, documented in 1995 that over 70% of adult Neanderthal skeletons show healed major trauma, crushed vertebrae, snapped limbs, fractured skulls, all of which had knitted back together, which means someone had to have kept those individuals alive long enough for bone to heal. That process takes weeks at minimum, often months. You can't hunt, haul, or run while it's happening. This is what researchers call the trauma amplification effect. A wound that would be survivable inside a group becomes geometrically more lethal the moment you're alone, and the math gets brutal fast. Ralph Selecki excavated Shanidar Cave in Iraq in 1957 and found an individual now called Shanidar I who had a withered arm, a crushed leg, and was probably blind in one eye, at least 5 major trauma sites on a single body, and yet lived for years, possibly decades, years. That's a care network so reliable it kept a partially blind, one-armed man fed through an Iraqi winter, which is honestly more than some modern institutions manage. Now, put that same man outside the group, alone. A single sprained ankle in open terrain without someone to fetch water or watch the ridge while you sleep tips you toward death within days. The trauma amplification effect doesn't care how tough you are. It cares how many hands you have nearby. And since Trinkhaus showed that catastrophic injury was essentially standard for Neanderthal adults, expulsion from the group wasn't a social punishment. It was a delayed execution with extra steps. Tusk would like you to note that "I need literally one other person" has now escalated, in your exile, from a logistical observation to something that wakes you up at night, sweating, with the specific face of someone who has just understood a tax form. The healed bones of your ancestors are not trophies of toughness. They are receipts, signed by every person who stayed to help, written permanently into calcium and collagen. Survival was always collective. The skeleton just kept the ledger. And yet, beyond the body's fragility, there is something even more lethal waiting in the dark. Something with 4 legs and excellent eyesight, which is exactly what you'll meet in Scene from the Grass. So here's the obvious objection. Modern survival stories, solo crossings, lone mountaineers, that one guy who cut off his own arm in a Utah canyon, suggest exceptional individuals really can beat these odds. Isn't this just selection bias toward the average? Yes, exactly. The non-survivors left no podcast. Now consider what you actually are, Seen from the Grass. Craig Packer spent years tracking lion kills across the Serengeti, and his 1994 data on solitary large primates delivers a number that should permanently rearrange your priorities. Alone, your predation risk rises up to 10 times higher than it would be inside a group. Not slightly elevated. 10 times. The mechanism is called sentinel collapse, and it is devastatingly simple. A group of 12 humans watching the grass means 12 pairs of eyes cycling through alertness, so that while you sleep, 11 people are still paying attention. Remove 11 people, and the math does not just get worse, it disappears entirely. Your ancestors understood this the way you understand breathing, not as a philosophy, but as a continuous, involuntary background hum. Every individual in a group offloads a fraction of their vigilance onto the collective, and the collective returns the favor, and somehow the whole system holds. You are not built for solo sentry duty. Your sleep cycles alone prove it. You cycle into deep, effectively helpless unconsciousness several times a night, which is a completely reasonable strategy when 4 other people are awake, and a remarkable gift to every lion within half a kilometer when you are alone. Picture the exile somewhere on the Serengeti's edge, having just brought down something worth eating. The carcass needs moving before the smell draws attention. The move requires both hands. Watching requires both eyes. Somewhere in the animal logic of that moment, a very specific thought crosses their face. I need literally one other person, with the particular expression of someone who has only just understood a joke they were the punchline of. Safety is not a feature of the individual. It is an emergent property of the collective, something that exists only in the space between people, the way a conversation requires 2 mouths. The illusion that you can stand alone against the world is precisely that. A very convincing, very dangerous illusion that the Serengeti has been quietly testing for millions of years and grading on a pass-fail curve. Which brings you to fire. And the question of what happens to the exile's fire, the only remaining equalizer against the dark, which is exactly where fire goes out begins. You crouch at the edge of your fire, and it looks fine. It looks alive. But you have not slept in 2 days. That distinction matters more than almost anything else in the story of human survival, because fire is not a tool you carry. It is a relationship you maintain, and relationships require rest, and rest requires someone else to watch. Dennis Sandgatha at Simon Fraser University spent years in 2011 working through ethnographic records of fire maintenance, and what he found should quietly unsettle you. Keeping fire alive demands near constant attention and a genuine social division of labor across the group. A single person exiled into the Pleistocene without fire-starting equipment, and fire-starting equipment requires multi-step manufacture that itself requires a community to teach and supply, would almost certainly lose their fire to the first serious rainstorm. Not eventually. This is what researchers call pyrrhic dependency failure, which sounds clinical until you realize it just means your fire went out and you are now the same temperature as the night around you, which is not a good temperature to be. Here is the part that should land like cold water. You probably assumed fire was yours. You made it, or you took it from a struck stone, or you carried it in a clay pot the way the Hadza still carry embers wrapped in bark today. And that act of carrying felt like ownership. It was not. The moment you cannot keep 2-hour vigils through a downpour, the moment you cannot split the night watch with another warm body, the fire begins losing the argument against entropy. Entropy wins every single time it gets the chance. Somewhere in the imagined theater of exile, a figure tries to move a red deer carcass off a slope before dark, and pauses, and has a thought that arrives with the force of obvious revelation. I need literally one other person. The thought is not complicated. Neither is the problem, and that is somehow the worst part. The real weight of pyrrhic dependency failure is this. The things we call technologies are actually relationships wearing a hard shell. A fire is not a flame. It is the agreement between a dozen people to keep waking each other up through the night. Lose the people, lose the warmth, lose the shell entirely. The technology was always the trust, which means if even fire could not be held alone, what drove communities to weaponize exile in the first place? And how deliberately did they do it, which is exactly the question exile as execution was built to answer. So here's the obvious objection. Surely exile was just sending someone away, not killing them. Maybe they found another group. Maybe they managed fine alone. The wilderness is big. Right. Desperately, statistically, almost comically wrong. Here's why it matters. Every legal system that ever put words to punishment quietly understood the same arithmetic. Anthropologist Christopher Boehm at Vanderbilt surveyed 339 forager societies and found the majority used ostracism and banishment as deliberate, recurring tools, not improvised fury, not a bad week, but a social technology, refined across deep time the way you refine a good knife. The groups that needed it most used it most consistently, which tells you something about how well it worked. Call it social capital punishment. The name earns itself when you look at what Rome actually wrote into law around 450 BCE. Aquae et ignis interdictio, the formal interdiction of water and fire. The architects of the Republic, people who built aqueducts and codified everything, chose as their exile penalty the withdrawal of two things any child knows you cannot live without. They weren't being poetic. They were being precise. The exiled Roman wasn't sentenced to wander. He was sentenced to die slowly, at a distance, with the state's hands technically clean. The Vikings and Anglo-Saxons made the same equation with less Latin and more bluntness. The Old English word utlagi, root of our word outlaw, meant, around 900 CE, a person placed outside the law and therefore outside protection, which in practice meant outside humanity. You were already dead. Anyone could kill you without consequence because legally nothing was there to kill. Tusk, hearing this for the first time, would simply stare. Then he'd try to lift a carcass alone, feel his spine protest and think, I need literally one other person. That thought, that stunned, specific realization is exactly what made banishment lethal without a single act of violence. The exiled individual didn't need an enemy. The wilderness provided. No fire sharing meant cold nights. No partner meant no sleeping safely, no cracking a marrow bone, no second set of eyes on the ridge. Banishment is perhaps the oldest and most efficient death penalty ever devised. No blood on anyone's hands, no body to bury, just the slow arithmetic of the wilderness, working quietly on schedule. But if exile was always understood to be lethal, what did it cost the group that cast someone out? And was the punishment ever really one-sided, which is the uncomfortable question at the heart of the cost of casting out? But the lethality of exile, grim as it is, isn't the strange part. The strange part is that the group doing the banishing got hurt too, and almost certainly knew it on some level, and did it anyway. That tension is the bilateral exile penalty in plain sight, and understanding it changes what punishment means for a social species. Population genetic modeling by researchers at the Wellcome Sanger Institute suggests that Pleistocene human bands numbered somewhere between 20 and 50 individuals, which means a single exile reduced the group's effective survival unit by somewhere between 2 and 5%. A quiet hemorrhage, not a rounding error. You lose 2% of a modern hospital's staff during a crisis, and administrators call it catastrophic. Lose it from a band of 30 people who share every skill, every memory of where the water doesn't dry up in August, and every copy of the genes that might resist whatever fever is coming next. And you've amputated something real. The group called it discipline. Evolution called it a self-inflicted wound. Tusk's face watching this logic unfold suggests he finds the whole arrangement professionally baffling. The emotional weight compounds the arithmetic. Osteological evidence from early Homo sapiens at Kafse Cave in Israel, dated to around 92,000 years ago, shows deliberate burial with ochre and grave goods, meaning these were people embedded in rituals of grief and bonding deep enough to leave marks in the archaeological record. Bernard van der Meersch excavated those burials in 1969, and what he found wasn't just bodies, it was evidence of communities that mourned. Rip someone from that web of belonging, and the rupture doesn't heal cleanly on either side. The exile grieves, and the band grieves a version of the exile too, whether they admit it or not. Then there's the violent coda. Marthe and Saint-Just-Picard excavated the Tevieck burial site in Brittany in 1928, uncovering individuals around 6,500 years old with arrowheads still embedded in their bones. And some researchers read the outlier burials there as exiles who tried to come home and were killed for it. The exile, alone in the dark, carcass too heavy to drag, no one watching his back while he sleeps, marrow bone cracking nobody, arrives at the same stunned realization every single time. He needs literally one other person, desperately. Every exile is a mutual wound. The group amputates something and calls it order, never quite accounting for the knowledge, the kinship, and the genetic diversity that walked out into the dark and never returned, which is exactly the pattern of radical interdependence that raises the deeper question explored in No Lone Survivors, the obligate sociality theorem. Meaning, you don't choose to need people. You were built incomplete without them, the same way a bee isn't optional to the hive. Here's why this matters more than it sounds. Anthropologist Richard Lee spent time in 1968 with the Ekong-san of the Kalahari Desert in Botswana. People who know that landscape the way you know your own kitchen. And what his data showed is quietly devastating. A lone individual separated from the group, even one with full knowledge of the terrain, faces death within days to weeks, not months, not a heroic season of self-discovery. Days. The Kalahari does not grade on a curve. And before you picture this lone survivor as some hapless stranger, understand they are the expert. They know every water hole, every edible root, every poisonous berry by shape. None of that saves them, because survival in an arid environment isn't a knowledge problem. It's a labor distribution problem. You cannot watch for predators and sleep at the same time. You cannot carry a carcass and a child simultaneously. You cannot crack a marrow bone without someone holding the other end. Every 30 minutes, Tusk runs the same stunned calculation and lands on the same answer. He needs literally one other person, a realization delivered with the dawning horror of a mathematician who keeps getting zero. The cognitive side is darker still. Susan Curtis at UCLA published her landmark 1977 study of Jeannie, a child kept in near total isolation. And what she found was that without social reinforcement, language doesn't just stall, it deteriorates. The architecture of complex planning, the internal grammar that lets you sequence a hunt or negotiate a trade, quietly dismantles itself when no one talks back. A Pleistocene exile, separated long enough, wouldn't just get lonely. They would gradually lose the very mental tools the landscape demands, like a surgeon whose hands forget the knife. What this means is uncomfortable but clarifying. You are not an individual who occasionally cooperates. You are a fragment of a superorganism who occasionally forgets that fact. And exile doesn't reveal the outer limits of human capability. It reveals what humans actually are when the superorganism comes apart. The exiled person doesn't discover themselves. They discover the shape of the whole they left behind. Which raises the next question. If we are this irreducibly social, what happens inside the group when the social contract itself begins to fray? So come back to that ridge. You are standing there again, holding that scraping stone, watching the last figure dissolve into the tall grass. And here is what you now know that you didn't before. The cold wasn't the danger. The silence wasn't the punishment. The real sentence had already been carried out weeks earlier, in 100 small exclusions you barely noticed. A fire you weren't called to. A kill you weren't offered a share of. A watch rotation that quietly forgot your name. By the time you were physically alone, you were already gone. That is what exile actually is. Not a moment, but a slow erasure. And if belonging is something that can be withdrawn, that gradually, that invisibly, that deliberately, what does it take to keep it?